Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Social Media in the Workplace webinar. My name is David Griffiths. I'm a Director of CompliSpace, and this afternoon we're going to go through a number of the do's and don'ts around social media and so forth. We're going to talk about what social media is and talk about how we formulate policies and the importance of these things in the workplace. Just before we get going, however, I would just like to flag a few things about this webinar. First and foremost, on your screen you will have a console, and through that console you can actually ask questions. I have a colleague with me here who'll be taking in those questions as we go, and I'll endeavour to answer your questions about social media and about policies and the do's and don'ts and so forth as we go through this webinar. I will have to take some questions, no doubt, on notice if I don't know the answers to them, but I'll endeavour to find the answers and distribute those to people after this webinar. After the webinar we will shoot out an email to everyone with a link to the presentation for your own future use and a link to the recording. We are recording this session. I would urge you, if you do have questions, please do pipe up and type those in as we go through this. Now, we have about 40 minutes to go through social media in the workplace. It's a huge area. We're really going to cover it from about 20,000 feet in the next 40 minutes. I would urge you all to have a look on our website, and that's www.complispace.com.au, at some of the blogs. We've done a 5-part blog series over the last few weeks around social media that really does give some good practical information around how to manage social media in your workplace. So I'd urge you to go on there and have a look at that. Firstly, as we get into it, have a look at this screen. I'm sure you'll recognise some of the different brand names on here, but I think the major message is that social media is many and varied. It is growing every day. There are literally thousands of different applications that people now consider social media and use for that purpose. We tend to focus on just some of the ones that we use every day, but really it is a very, very, very wide-brimmed bucket when you're talking about social media. What we're going to go through in this webinar is we're going to talk about what it is. We're going to discuss a few of the trends that we're currently seeing in workplaces. And in particular some of those pitfalls around those trends, and a little bit on the recent case law. I won't go into it in great detail. If you are interested in that area, then do feel free to make contact with us and we can have further discussion around that. I'm going to talk about critically the key risks facing employers. And I would just urge, as we go through this, urge you to consider that really social media is very much interconnected with all different functional areas of your organisation, and that's probably the most important message from this whole webinar, is to understand that social media is not just simply one siloed area of risk. It is a risk area that really is cross-functional in nature and crosses many different parts of your organisation. So you need to think about it holistically. We're going to talk about how you design an appropriate social media policy, and then some of the do's and indeed some of the don'ts around social media. So what is social media? Well, let's start by going to that great social media site itself, Wikipedia, and focus on the definition there. And Wikipedia says that social media includes web-based and mobile technologies used to turn communication into interactive dialogue that allow the creation and exchange of user-generated content. Look, the critical message with respect to social media is about change. And whilst there aren't many constants in life, I guess death, taxes, I guess the critical third one is change. We're seeing it in the economy every day now, and we see it in the workplace every day as well. And that is the big message about social media, is it is constantly growing and constantly changing. You don't have to believe me, so let's see what those lies and statistics all say on this issue. from a recent Fast Company survey, and this was a survey that was done of some 1,000 business professionals through Fast Company, and it found that 91%, as you can see here, 91% of those surveyed actually use email, and some 89 to 90% use corporate email. What I find interesting from this survey, and if I think about my own personal experience in my own career, when I started out sort of post-university some 20 years ago or so now, working in law firm as article clerk, I remember my partner in charge coming into me back then and holding up a fax and saying, "David, look at this facsimile, isn't it amazing? It's just so instant, isn't it extraordinary the way technology has changed?" Skip forward 20 years to today and look at how we are operating today. Look at that graph and focus in for a second on the fact that about 60% of people are now using Facebook. Facebook was only started in February 2004. We're already seeing 60% of people using it. Okay, look at the YouTube. 10% are using YouTube. YouTube now is it's certainly in the top 3 or 4 search engines available online. We live in an environment today where there is massive change. There is a massive amount of information flowing at us and to us through the use of technology. And really, to a certain extent, you know, we have to embrace it. That is the only way. We can't reject it. We absolutely have to embrace it in a commercial context. Let's have a look at what some of the stats say around that. And those stats include the fact that a quarter of small to mid-size enterprise and 50% of larger companies are actually using social media as a professional tool. Now, that might be using it, they might be tweeting, they might have their Facebook pages, they might even through executives or staff members control LinkedIn groups and the like. They certainly will be blogging externally from a marketing perspective, but they might also be using different social media internally and have smaller micro blogging structures internally and wikis set up and so forth. We're seeing that more and more, and that is a great means of efficiency both externally and internally. We indeed have a detailed strategy around that with respect to our own organisation here. And we've found some great, to be honest, we've found some fantastic publications that have helped us enormously as to how to embrace social media with limited resources. So if anyone is interested in finding out what we've used here, I'd be happy to tell you after this. Please do make contact and I can provide that information. So social media use at work is no longer limited, and I find this a little bit unfair anyway. It's no longer limited to young professionals and members of Generation Y. It's much more mainstream now. I think a really important one is this increase in online bullying and inappropriate conduct through social media. I heard a great comment the other day, and it was that just because we've grown up with the internet, it doesn't mean that the internet has grown up. And that's a really important point when it comes to this issue of the increase in bullying and inappropriate behaviour via the internet. It's a classic where, you know, good people who would normally behave well sometimes behave very poorly under the cloak of anonymity. And how do we control that in workplaces? Well, it all comes down to that issue of education, of setting expectations, of using culture as the best form of control, but indeed of defining that culture and of educating our staff as to how we want that culture conveyed in the workplace. And indeed having tools throughout the use of our own internal social media to enable things like workplace grievances to be aired in the appropriate forum and not via social media for all to see. What's the legal impact of all of this? Well, look, the case law in this area is relatively new, and it is growing. We're seeing more and more coming out about this every day, and you only need to track around some of the law firm newsletters and blogs and so forth, and you'll see more and more comment around appropriate and inappropriate use of social media. I think it really comes down to a number of key points. The first one is that the legal ramifications around use of social media centre on the conduct of employees generally around social media. That's what we're really talking about in general terms, and that's what most of the case law is, in fact all of it at this point is talking about from a legal impact perspective. Second one is that all centres on that what we would describe as the employee's right to privacy in relation to their personal life versus the employer or the company's right to protect its own corporate reputation and indeed the reputations of its staff within the organisations. I should just qualify that, not just the reputations of its staff, but the health and safety of staff within those and workers within those organisations. The key points from the cases really come down to three key issues as we see them. The first one is that there needs to be, through the employee's conduct, some ready connection with their employer or the company that engages them. It's not good enough that to claim that someone has behaved inappropriately online in a particular forum if there can't be any direct or readily available indirect connection all the way back to their employer. The second key issue is it generally will relate to damage to the employer, so disparaging comments about the employer that might cause it loss, about the employer's customers or relationships with customers. I mean, the classic is the blog or the comment in Facebook by an employee saying that, you know, my work sucks, my company doesn't do what it says it's going to do, the executives don't live up to the values of the company and it's all a big lie. That sort of thing, that sort of disparaging remark around the employer or the company. There's also that issue of disparagement of other employees, and that's an absolutely critical one, and there are a number of cases covering that issue. And again, it's a similar situation where using something like Facebook, comments are made in relation to another employee that gets back to the other employee or back to the company through that ready connection to the employer. The final issue is that conduct must be of such a nature that it is what you'd describe as incompatible with the employee's duties under their employment. Now, those duties to their employer might be set out in an employment contract. They might be common law duties. They might be set out in policies and procedures. Clearly, what needs to be demonstrated is that conduct is clearly incompatible with the way they should be behaving in a public forum in that way. The final 2 points I'd make about that with respect to legal impact are, first one, look, there are a range of controls that are used to help to minimise the risk of what I describe as adverse risk events of situation arising through use of social media. And they include things like employment contracts, social media policies, various other policies. The most important point I'd make about that is that a social media policy doesn't sit alone. And this is, if you take anything away from this webinar, take this point. Social media does not operate in a vacuum. A social media policy does not act as a control in a vacuum. It cannot stand alone. It must work in conjunction with a range of other policies, procedures, training and testing programs in any organisation, all of which form part of a proper workplace relations, call it HR and work health and safety, compliance infrastructure or program in any organisations. Other policies and procedures that relate back to social media and help support the controls that are put in place from those policies include things like anti-bullying policies, EEO anti-discrimination policies and the like. just general internet usage policies, discipline and termination procedures, privacy policies, recruitment policies, and of course general training and testing all the way through. You can get a feel for that whilst I'm not trying to complicate everything, what I am saying is that if you just rely on a social media policy to control the use of social media, critically to minimise the risks associated with social media, then you do so at your peril. Okay, because it's really a holistic approach to your people risk management. And last time I looked, I haven't yet come across a company that's not run by people, and when dealing with issues like social media, despite the big technological and online flavour to it, it is all about managing people. So HR policies and programs, work health and safety policies and programs, these are all people risk management programs, all about managing and managing our people risk. The final issue is that one that we're seeing around prospective employees, where many employers now are actually using social media to vet and assess prospective employees during the course of the recruitment process. That comes with its own risks. And in fact, there was some data that came out, or some research from, I think it was Telstra, late last year, that said that in fact a quarter of Australian employers are now using social networking sites to screen job candidates, and almost half of them are admitting that they turn away prospects based on something they've seen on Facebook or Twitter. That comes with enormous risk itself, because we have privacy concerns about the use of social media with respect to prospective employees, and there are potential claims that come on the back of that. It's not to say you shouldn't do it, but it certainly should be disclosed in the recruitment process, and you cannot rely on information gleaned from that process that could be potentially discriminatory in the decisions that we're making. Okay, next key issue is some of the key risks that are facing employers. I think one of the main ones that we certainly started seeing when social media first started being used was this issue of excessive personal use. That, I think, has been, I do recall about 2 years ago seeing organisations where they'd have extremely strict internet usage policies and social media policies that would effectively prohibit use throughout the whole organisation. We're seeing that less and less these days, to be honest, and the reason why, arguably, is because it's accepted that this is just another form of communication, and indeed companies are embracing that for their own use now. What we do see is policies and procedures limiting people's use, and critically helping to influence and control the use of social media in the workplace from the perspective of productivity and so forth, as well as all those reputational risks I just mentioned. The other key one is staff members publishing inappropriate material, and that's really a critical focus around a personal social media use policy. And the next one there is around not using social media for fear of what can go wrong. You know, we put that in as a critical risk. We see that as a major opportunity cost for organisations. And, you know, if you're in an organisation that refuses to go near using social media organisationally, well, there's only so long, in my view, that refusal is going to go on, because the reality is if you use social media properly, whether you're using it as a recruitment tool, whether you're using it as a marketing tool, whether you're using it for internal efficiencies as an operational tool, the critical issue is if used properly, it can give you competitive advantage and an increase in productivity. It's as simple as that. That issue around employers using social media in the recruitment process I've already mentioned. The use of social media there, the major message is that it needs to be tightly controlled, okay? One needs to understand what you can and can't do through social media. There needs to be disclosure to the prospective employee or the applicant, let's call them, And we just need to understand the risks at the back end of all of that if we fail to use it properly. Critical area around inappropriate use of social media is the increase in bullying and harassment claims. We see a lot in the press these days around cyberbullying in the schoolyard. In fact, it is extremely prevalent now in the employment area as well. And the difference between the schoolyard and the employment arena, of course, as we all know, is often with kids in school they can settle bullying through various means, and it might be often confrontational, but certainly with the help of teachers and so forth. In the workplace with adults, it's often not quite as simple as that, and certainly where ego and adults are concerned, settling bullying-related issues or reporting up on bullying-related issues and lodging grievances is often done very late in the process when enormous amounts of personal damage has occurred. Another critical one is this one of complaints handling, and that's where compliant. Sorry about that. I think I've just got a. I think my. Sorry, I think my. We just had a problem with the webinar software, but we should be back on. The critical one there is where a client's complaints might go viral. Now, the really important message there, I would say, from a control perspective, is to ensure that we have a proper complaint handling process in place to ensure that if we see a client complaint end up in social media, we address it proactively. We don't just react to it. We jump in there, we try and deal with the complaint. We try to, as we all know, that when dealing with a complaint, recovering from that exercise, it often can leave the relationship even better off than it was prior to the complaint occurring. But we deal with it in such a way, and then we politely ask the client to remove their complaint from the social media, the relevant forum. That's just one of those risks facing the employers. Some of the other ones, and these are critical ones, are things like leaking of confidential information. It's often inadvertent around that, but it's an absolutely huge security risk. Generally bringing the company into disrepute is one. The case law in this area focuses invariably in relation to unfair dismissal claims, and they're often brought about as a result of this public airing of employee grievances. I think there's a real issue around the ambiguity as well involved in the ownership of social media accounts. We see that in particular around LinkedIn. The final one is this overriding adverse impact on brand and reputation, and that's a critical one that really is an umbrella effect over the whole of the risk area facing employers. Just having a look at a couple of questions that have just come through. One of them is says, regarding staff members publishing inappropriate material, should that include what they publish in their personal profiles, even outside working hours? Well, absolutely. I'm going to come to that in a second on a personal social media policy basis. But I would just say to you that going back to that issue of inappropriate comments and so forth, what the biggest issue with the use of social media by staff members, and that's where the real focus is in the risk areas, is that the nexus between their personal life and what they might, the comments they might make about their employer, and that connection with the employer. Because once something goes on the internet, it's there for everyone to see. It's not just a comment they're making at the cafe to a friend or at the pub to a friend. It is a comment they're making on the World Wide Web, which is just that. It's worldwide. And there, as an employer, we can absolutely control and put policy in place to minimise those risks. The biggest issue about the internet is change, okay, and that's what we have to accept here. I love these quotes. The internet's the first thing that humanity has built that humanity doesn't understand. It's the largest experiment in anarchy that we've ever had. And then this other one from Eric Schmidt, saying that every 2 days we create as much information as we did from the dawn of civilization up until 2003. What that means, the online environment is all about change and we have to embrace it. And the real point is that if we continue to do what we've always done, we're going to get what we've always got. All right, and we're exposing ourselves to risk. We have to move forward and shake the tree a bit and do things differently. And we have to understand critically, we have to embrace and understand social media from that perspective. So when designing a policy, we have to understand, again, my most important point of this webinar, that social media doesn't operate in isolation. We have to link our policies with our employment contracts. We have to link them with other policies and procedures, particularly in relation to those issues that you see in front of you: privacy, discrimination, harassment, bullying and violence, recruitment and selection, codes of conduct if you have them in your organisation, critically training in relation to all of the above, and discipline and termination procedures. We have to link all of that through and contemplate the use of social media across all of those as well. So what do? When designing a social media policy, look, we always recommend that you build two different policies. Okay, the first one is business usage, the second one personal usage. Now the business usage policy is really designed for those companies that publish social media or publish on their own account using social media tools, and that might be those companies that tweet, that publish blogs. It could be a whole range of different tools that you use through social media. And we take a really, really simple view on this. You can't publish content under a corporate banner unless A, you've received specific training, and B, you've received specific authorization to do so. Now your authorization may be limited in nature. It may say you can only publish on certain topics, on certain days, using certain tools, but you need to have these checks and measures in place. Okay, we refer to these guys in the policies we put in place for clients as authorized social media publishers. And most importantly, you have to keep records of all of this to understand who can do what. So maintain a register. As I said, different staff will be authorised for the different tools and different subject matter and so forth. The really important thing that I find is that you need to encourage all staff to be involved in your social media footprint. Okay, encourage all staff to want to become a publisher of social content, to take ownership of that and to take real interest in social media and how the company is leveraging its position through the use of social media. There are really 5 golden rules of business usage. The first one is promotion, and that is, does what you are publishing help to and support that underlying issue of promoting the corporate brand and promoting what you're about as a business? That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is protection. Protection of brand, protection of individual reputations, and that may well include individual reputations of fellow colleagues. It may include protection of reputations of your clients, of your suppliers and other stakeholders in your business. Number 3, if in doubt, ask. Ask whoever is the social media publishing guru in your organisation, because there will be one. So if in doubt, don't publish, but ask the question. Number 4 is all about privacy. Understand the privacy considerations that you need to take into account. Look, one of the issues is that whilst the privacy laws don't apply per se to in the employment relationship, that doesn't mean that you go off and breach various and disclose various private personal information of your colleagues through social media. Absolutely go and ask, just as if the privacy laws did apply in the employment relationship. Take care to understand these things. Number 5 is that the best social media is the best content that is published is conversational in tone, and it's conversational in nature. There's no use if you're using, I find, even looking at YouTube and looking at web videos, seeing amateurs or non-professionals attempting to put a fully professionally produced video online, and forgive me if you've recently gone out and done this yourself, I think that the best social media video that you see around getting experts out there to talk about their messages, the stuff that is conversational in tone, that you know is not being done by a non-professional trying desperately to look like a professional. It tends to be the stuff that's done by a non-professional anchored person or presenter, where they're just talking about that issue that they're passionate about, and you can get their passion from that conversational tone and get their key messages. There needs to be that clear statement of seriousness of using social media and the consequences if it is used inappropriately. Okay, and that ultimate consequence is around disciplinary procedures and termination. That has to be built into your policy. Absolutely critical. So talking about the personal usage policy, this all comes back to what your staff members are saying through their personal use of social media and how you can, as an employer, influence their use. The most important points to make in that policy. Firstly, it's designed to protect both the organisation and your staff. Okay? Set expectations through a policy. Set out the do's and don'ts. Bullet point them out. Use examples. Don't just make great principle-based statements that a staff member then has to interpret. Set out information. You can make a principle-based statement, but then set out a whole lot of bullet points giving examples, inclusive examples of exactly what you're talking about. State unequivocally that your policy prohibits negative comments being made about the organisation and about other individuals in the organisation, their colleagues, other stakeholders around the organisation. Okay? Provide guidance for staff members around positive comments. Well, there's nothing worse than when someone unashamedly starts gushing about an organisation, and you know full well that it's really just a sales pitch for their own company for whatever reason. Set guidelines around what you expect around honesty and the use of that conversational statements. Now, they might be really positive about what's going on, but people can pick an honest statement fairly quickly these days through the public web forums and the like. Make it clear what your expectations are with respect to personal usage during business hours. It's very easy for people to lose hours on Facebook. Okay? When I was at university, there were a number of video games going around, one of which was, I remember, a game called Doom. And I remember hearing some of my university mates losing days playing that game and coming into uni days later and saying, sorry, I got stuck playing Doom for 12 hours. That's the same sort of thing can happen on Facebook. So be very clear with respect to your staff on what your expectations are around personal usage. And it may well be that you limit personal usage entirely, that you limit it only to lunch hours, or that you restrict it entirely until outside work hours. State clearly the consequences of inappropriate use of social media. Okay, look, the do's and don'ts. There are millions of do's and don'ts around social media. Jump onto Google and search them and you'll see there are plenty, but really they fall into some basic areas. There's the do's and don'ts of drafting the policy. There's the do's and don'ts of developing your strategy. Again, I'd just say if anyone's interested, we can point you to what we've used around our social media strategy at a later time. There are the do's and don'ts then of social media interaction generally. Some of the do's. There's a lot of words on this slide. I'll run through them fairly quickly. The first one is to remember that comments are public. There's a reason why it's called the World Wide Web. It's because it goes worldwide. Okay, they're easily accessible, irrespective of security parameters and closed groups and so forth. And on that basis, I'd flag the recent issue with the Defence Force and that closed group and the Four Corners expose in relation to some of the inappropriate conduct over the last month that we saw there. Do use common sense. It's a classic one in that field of workplace relations. Not strict, certainly not legally correct, but a generalisation there is in the field of workplace relations. Call it HR, call it safety. Social media certainly fits under that umbrella. we as employers, we really do have an obligation to go out and train common sense. Okay, it's as simple as that. So we say to our staff, do use common sense and do it yourself. Be polite. It's an obvious one. Don't rely on that shroud of anonymity to go and make inappropriate, aggressive statements that you wouldn't otherwise make in an open meeting. Safeguard your social media accounts with the highest settings available, both personally and as a business. Get them hack-proof. Nothing worse than seeing someone else access a Facebook page and put inappropriate photos or embarrassing statements in there. Recent case at one of the major investment banks where someone got hold of someone else's email account and started shooting out stupid emails, resulted in half a dozen key people being fired. Respect copyright. Don't try and claim things that someone else has written as your own. Obvious, but needs to be said. Be transparent. Don't hide behind the shroud or the cloud of the internet. Okay, declare if you're trying to sell something. You can say, I'm promoting this, I've been engaged to do so, but I believe in it, whatever the case may be. Respecting privacy, I've already talked about that. But respect your colleagues' privacy and anyone else's. Think about your reputation. Once the information's out there, it's there forevermore, even if you then take it off. Okay, someone can always find the shadow of that information. Think about your employer's reputation and that of your colleagues. Be prepared to defend your position for statements that are made. Very simple. That sort of points back to all of the other do's around the nature of the content that you're putting on there. Make sure your posts aren't in breach or certainly aren't in knowing breach of your employment contract, but if in doubt and you've got a suspicion that might be pushing the envelope, check before you make a post. Check that it doesn't breach a policy of the company before you post your blog or whatever the case may be. Make it clear that any views expressed are your own, if indeed you're expressing your own views, okay, and not those of the company. It's a really important one. And finally, I'd say have regard to this issue of anti-discrimination, harassment, equal employment opportunity and the like. That is where you will come unstuck in relation to, and that is where people do come unstuck every day in relation to some of the comments that they're making, particularly around cyberbullying and so forth. It's extremely important that people understand that. So what do we do around that in our organisations? Well, we do training for all of our staff on all of those key policies covering those issues. We connect our social media policies back to the underlying obligations in relation to EEO, anti-discrimination, bullying and violence, and we link those policies so that everyone is absolutely and abundantly clear on their obligations. What are some of the don'ts around this? Well, they're pretty obvious, but let's go through them quickly. Don't post negative comments with respect to your colleagues, with respect to those that you report to or anyone else around the business. Fairly obvious comment, but one that is, we're seeing more and more of that type of behaviour in the various cases that are running through the courts at the moment. Don't post defamatory, obscene material in relation or hateful material in relation to another person or an entity. Again, that's fairly obvious, common sense, but a great way to avoid coming unstuck in this area is just simply to not conduct yourself in that way. Don't disclose information you've gained through employment that's confidential or commercial in confidence. Okay, it's critical to have a confidentiality policy. It's critical to have a confidentiality provision in an employment contract. Critically, beyond that, it is essential that all staff are trained in relation to what is confidential information of that company. And I would, in our environment, we work in a fast growth business and we're constantly recruiting more staff, and I don't take it as given that the new graduate that you've just brought into your organisation understands what is confidential and what is not. Absolutely go through detailed induction training around confidentiality and around the nature of confidential information and make it as clear as day as to what your expectations are and what information it should be kept confidential both during and after their employment ceases. Don't engage in activity that reflects poorly on the employer. Again, commonsensical but critical. and don't use the employer's brands, logos, trademarks. Don't pass yourself off as being the employer, and don't use their IP is the critical one. I've just had another question that's come through. Does an employer have the right to monitor an employee's emails when they're using their work email address, monitoring volume to confirm too many personal emails and monitoring content? And does this need to be disclosed? There are two answers to that. The first one is yes, you do have the right to monitor the use of emails, but secondly, you can only do so if you provide the relevant notices under the workplace surveillance legislation in your state. Don't know where that person, whether that person's in New South Wales, Western Australia, or where, but each state has workplace surveillance legislation that broadly speaking requires an employer to give their employees notice that where an employee is using company property such as email, internet, telephones, anything like that, that they might observe and or check that information. They might observe and or check that information from time to time. That person came back and said they're in South Australia. Yes, you will have the workplace surveillance legislation in South Australia that will say just that. Same thing goes with CCTV and with listening devices in the workplace. You can't do it without giving the relevant notices first. The final point I'd make, just to wrap it up now, as we are nearly at the end of this webinar. The final point I would make, which is more in the positive side of the use of social media. Social media is here to stay. It is a wonderful tool if used properly in the workplace, if used properly at a personal level. Critically, it's an incredibly powerful tool to interact with your audience, with your stakeholders, with your tribe, whatever you want to call them. So as I said earlier, one of the greatest risks that we see with respect to social media is the risk that the fear of using it at a commercial level, the fear for an organisation of jumping in and seeing how they can help build their organisation and strengthen their relationships through the use of social media. It offers an incredible opportunity, and I would urge you all to jump in and have a look at how that, if you're not already doing so, how that can help you externally to help to reinforce your positioning in your marketplace, and or internally to enable better productivity in your workplace, and indeed thinking about things like recruitment and alumni management for your workplaces. It really is an incredible tool with incredible opportunity associated with it. Can I finally finish off by saying thank you very much for attending this webinar. The purpose of the webinar is to give you a bit of education around some of those trends and the do's and don'ts around social media and some of the issues that we need to deal with in building our personal usage policies and our business usage policies, not to mention the risks for employees and employers on the back end of that. I would urge you all, please do go to our website, that's www.complispace.com.au, and have a look at the recent blogs, series of blogs that we've done in this area. Look, we as an organisation specialise in delivering a full suite of governance, risk and compliance services and solutions to mid-market companies across a range of industries throughout all of Australia. These include putting in place detailed social media policies and online training courses as part of a comprehensive suite of human resources programs, work health and safety programs, policies and procedures. All of the content that we provide to our client organisations through these tools is kept up to date with changes in law in real time, and it's customised for the end organisational users. It's a very powerful tool, and it's a very cost-effective platform that we provide to the organisations that use it. Most importantly, it allows companies to really minimise risks associated with things like the use of social media, and critically it allows business owners and executives to sleep at night knowing that their businesses are being run very effectively, efficiently, and that risks are being minimised while they are doing so. We will contact you over the next 24 hours to send you a link to this webinar so that you can grab further information. I would urge you, please do make contact with us if you have further questions or comments to make. My email address will be in that email that comes out to you. It is, in the short term anyway, for the sake of the webinar now, it is david.griffiths@complispace.com.au, so do feel free to make contact with me. We'll also contact each of you to see whether or not you'd like to see a demo of our online policy management system and HR programs and work health and safety programs, so that you can see what I'm talking about in some context here. Thank you once again. I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation, and hope that you can join us for future webinars that we run. Many thanks. Bye.